The figures on the financial summary smeared together as Marcus Elwood pressed his fingertips against his forehead, the dull throb behind his eyes pulsing in time with the faint hum of the overhead lights. His office sat high above the city, glass walls and polished steel, meant to signal power and control. Yet lately it felt more like a cage than a command post. He had given nearly a quarter century to the corporation, nearly 2 decades to his marriage, and somehow both commitments had begun to feel like endurance tests rather than achievements. When he snapped his tablet shut and stood, the motion was sharper than necessary, frustration leaking through the cracks of his carefully managed exterior. The drive back through the outskirts of Raleigh stretched endlessly, traffic inching along familiar streets lined with identical houses and trimmed hedges, offering too much time to think. He dismantled struggling companies for a living, stripping them down piece by piece in the name of efficiency, while at home he felt something important loosening, fraying quietly beyond his reach. Over the last several months, his wife Claire had grown distant in ways that were subtle enough to explain away but persistent enough to gnaw at him. She flinched from casual touches, claimed exhaustion with increasing frequency, and filled her evenings with social plans that hadn't existed before. When he finally walked through the front door, he found her sitting upright on the sofa, hands folded neatly, posture unnaturally formal. The sight stopped him mid-step. In all their years together, she had never looked at him like that, as if bracing for impact. She didn't waste time easing into it. She looked up and said they needed to talk, her voice measured, rehearsed, and something in his gut tightened instantly. Those words carried weight, history, consequence. He set his bag down slowly, loosened his tie, and chose the armchair opposite her instead of the couch beside her, some instinct urging distance before his mind could articulate why. When he asked what this was about, his voice came out steady despite the tension humming through him. She spoke about their marriage, about them, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear in a nervous habit he remembered from years ago, back when uncertainty had been endearing instead of alarming. She asked him to listen without interrupting, and he nodded, feeling the same coiled readiness he felt before high-stakes negotiations. Then she said it carefully but clearly, suggesting they explore the idea of opening their marriage. The words lingered between them, heavy and toxic. He stared at her, struggling to reconcile this proposal with the woman he had married, the vows they had spoken, the life they had constructed on the assumption of exclusivity and trust. She rushed to explain, citing friends who had supposedly thrived this way, mentioning boundaries and rules as if that could neutralize the impact. He cut her off with a calmness that surprised even him, telling her to pack her things and leave. The precision of his words drained the color from her face, panic replacing preparation as her speech unraveled into apologies and frantic backtracking. He repeated himself, firmer this time, unmoved by tears or pleas, watching her composure collapse with the same detachment he brought to boardroom conflicts. When she finally broke down, crying openly and insisting she hadn't meant it, that she didn't truly want this, he observed her the way one might analyze a presentation that suddenly went off script. The timing, the emotional cues, the desperation all felt practiced, and he wondered whether she had always been this calculating or whether he was only now capable of seeing it. He warned her quietly that if she ever suggested such a thing again, their marriage would end immediately, and when she agreed through sobs and clutched at him, he allowed it without reciprocating, staring past her at the wall. His thoughts had already shifted gears. You didn't ask permission for something you hadn't already contemplated, or worse, acted on. That night she fell asleep quickly, exhausted from emotional exertion, turning away from him as she always had lately. He lay awake, staring at the slow rotation of the ceiling fan, replaying patterns he had previously ignored. Certain evenings she was always unavailable, always busy with vague commitments that never quite added up. Studying her sleeping face, still familiar, still beautiful, he whispered the realization aloud, cementing it in his own mind. By morning, he would know the truth. The strategist in him, sharpened by years of corporate warfare, had already begun outlining the steps. He arrived at his office before dawn, earlier than usual, relishing the emptiness of the building. Quiet made certain things easier. He shut his door, pulled up his contacts, and found the number he'd been given months earlier as a precaution he once laughed off. At the time, he'd believed his marriage unbreakable. That belief now felt naive. The investigator answered promptly, voice rough and unpolished, and Marcus stated his request without embellishment. They arranged to meet at a discreet restaurant later that day, and when the call ended, Marcus turned a framed photograph face down on his desk, unable to look at the memory it held. The morning passed in a blur of meetings he navigated on autopilot, his reputation for focus masking the fact that his mind was engaged elsewhere, dismantling something far more personal than a failing company. When he finally sat across from the investigator, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a notebook that had seen too much, Marcus slid over a folder he'd meticulously prepared. Inside was everything someone would need to track a person's movements: schedules, habits, locations. He asked for proof, nothing less, and made it clear that cost was irrelevant. Thoroughness and discretion were the only metrics that mattered. The investigator promised results quickly, and as Marcus walked back to his office, he felt an eerie calm settle in. Waiting was unpleasant, but he had endured worse. At home that evening, Claire made a point of cooking his favorite meal, pouring good wine, performing attentiveness with almost theatrical effort. It might have softened him days earlier, but now every gesture felt calculated. He answered her questions politely, noting how she avoided his gaze, how often her phone lit up beside her plate. She mentioned a friend's name and quickly corrected herself, sensing the tension. They ate mostly in silence, the ticking of the hallway clock louder than their conversation. Over the next day, Marcus watched more closely than he ever had before. The extra care she took with her appearance, the unfamiliar scent clinging to her clothes, the vague explanations that collapsed under mild scrutiny. When she announced plans that matched the investigator's timeline, his suspicions hardened into certainty. The confirmation came sooner than promised. A message, brief and clinical, arrived while Marcus sat alone at home. A hotel, a room number, a description of the man accompanying her. Photos followed moments later, each one landing with brutal clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for denial. The timestamps told a story of routine, not impulse. The final message identified the man, his job, his family. Marcus didn't rage. He didn't cry. What he felt was clarity, cold and absolute. He poured a drink and sat with the evidence, recognizing that this betrayal extended beyond his own marriage. Another family was being quietly dismantled alongside his. The investigator had already gathered everything necessary, but Marcus wasn't interested in half measures. He believed in consequences that matched the scale of the offense. He spent the next day researching the other man's wife, learning who she was, what she did, how her life intersected unknowingly with his own unraveling. The decision of how to approach her weighed on him, each option carrying its own cruelty, until he settled on honesty delivered directly. When he called her, he chose his words carefully, offering only enough to convey seriousness without inflicting harm over the phone. They agreed to meet somewhere public. When she arrived, weary but composed, he didn't waste time. He told her the truth plainly, sliding the photographs across the table and watching disbelief give way to recognition. She pieced together her husband's absences with horrifying speed, seeing the pattern he now knew by heart. She asked questions he answered honestly, never embellishing, never sparing detail where clarity was required. When she asked why he had come to her instead of handling things quietly, he explained that secrecy protected the wrong people. They talked strategy not out of malice but necessity. Lawyers, timing, confrontation. She revealed financial blind spots he immediately understood the implications of. They agreed that acting together would prevent coordination, prevent damage control, prevent lies from gaining traction. When they parted, there was no comfort offered, only mutual respect and grim resolve. That evening, Marcus returned home knowing the final act had already begun. Claire greeted him with forced brightness, unaware that her parallel life had collapsed hours earlier. He played his role until the appointed moment, watching the clock, letting her chatter fill the space. When the time came, he placed the envelope between them and told her to open it. The denial came predictably, then panic, then pleas. He informed her calmly that her partner's wife had been told that there would be no coordination, no escape. When she begged for forgiveness, counseling, another chance, he told her the paperwork had already been filed and explained the agreement she had signed years ago without reading. Each fact landed harder than anger ever could. He gave her an hour to leave. When the door finally slammed shut, the house fell quiet in a way it never had before. The staged romance remained half-finished, candles guttering, music playing to an empty room. He extinguished the flames, cleared the table, and answered a call confirming that the other confrontation had ended the same way. Standing alone in the space that had once defined his life, Marcus felt relief settle into his bones. Not joy, not triumph, but the profound peace that comes from ending a lie. The silence was honest now, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt able to breathe. Winter eased into early spring almost unnoticed, the weeks folding into one another as Marcus reshaped both his routines and his home. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of shared decisions and compromises. It became something mutable, responsive, his. Furniture was moved, then removed entirely, rooms repurposed without debate or negotiation. The formal dining room became a study lined with books he'd never had space for before, volumes on history, strategy, philosophy, subjects Claire had once dismissed as indulgent. The guest room was stripped down and repainted, neutral walls replacing the muted tones chosen years earlier to suit someone else's taste. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the structure itself had exhaled after holding tension for years. Work continued, relentless and demanding, but Marcus noticed he slept better despite the chaos. The constant undercurrent of suspicion that had haunted his final months of marriage was gone, replaced by a stark clarity that was sometimes painful but never confusing. Truth, he learned, carried its own kind of rest. His contact with Elise, the other betrayed spouse, became frequent, initially practical and transactional, then gradually more relaxed. They compared notes after meetings with attorneys, shared updates on paperwork and asset divisions, and occasionally traded dark humor that only someone who had been through the same fire could appreciate. She handled the aftermath with a composure that impressed him, balancing her professional life with the emotional labor of guiding her children through upheaval. He admired the way she spoke to them honestly without burdening them with details they didn't need, how she absorbed their anger without redirecting it outward. When she mentioned feeling overwhelmed, Marcus offered help without ceremony, picking up groceries or driving one of the kids to an activity when schedules collided. None of it felt romantic. It felt necessary, grounded, human. The legal process moved more efficiently than Marcus had expected. Evidence, when presented cleanly and without theatrics, tended to silence resistance. Claire's communications shifted from accusatory to pleading to erratic, a progression Marcus observed without responding. He filtered messages through his attorney, refusing to engage directly, knowing any interaction would reopen wounds without serving a purpose. Elise's situation followed a similar arc, though complicated by children and shared finances. Her resolve hardened as revelations piled up, accounts she hadn't known existed, decisions made without her input, years of quiet exclusion disguised as work obligations. Each discovery hurt, but each also clarified that the life she thought she had been protecting was already gone long before the truth surfaced. On a quiet Saturday morning, Marcus found himself sitting across from Elise at his kitchen table, both of them nursing coffee while the house hummed softly around them. It had become an unspoken ritual, these informal check-ins that required no agenda. She mentioned her children were beginning to laugh again, tentatively at first, then more freely, testing the boundaries of a world that felt safer now that secrets were no longer lurking beneath it. Marcus listened, aware of a subtle shift in himself as well. He no longer felt like an observer in his own life. Decisions were his again, unfiltered and unnegotiated, and the responsibility that came with that felt grounding rather than burdensome. Months passed. The divorces finalized within weeks of each other, signatures ending chapters that had been eroding for years. Claire received the minimum outlined by law and agreement: no dramatic courtroom battles, no grand speeches. The reality of her choices had stripped her of leverage. Marcus felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet acceptance that actions carried weight whether one acknowledged it or not. Elise's separation was more complex but equally definitive. The children adjusted faster than anyone expected, buoyed by consistency and honesty. Their resilience humbled Marcus, reminding him that truth, even when painful, provided a stronger foundation than carefully maintained illusions. Occasionally, news filtered back about their former spouses through mutual acquaintances or sheer coincidence. Claire was seen in familiar places with unfamiliar faces, repeating patterns with unsettling speed. Elise mentioned her ex had moved into a smaller apartment, cycling through excuses and apologies that rang hollow now that she recognized them for what they were. Marcus felt no urge to intervene, no lingering attachment to outcomes that no longer involved him. Detachment, he realized, wasn't indifference. It was freedom from responsibility for someone else's self-destruction. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the windows of his study, Marcus received a message from the investigator who had set everything in motion months earlier. It was brief, observational, offered without judgment. Marcus read it once, then deleted it, understanding that some chapters didn't need footnotes. He forwarded the sentiment to Elise with a single line of commentary, and her reply came back almost instantly, dry and amused. They had reached a shared language that required very few words. Their relationship evolved organically, without declarations or dramatic turning points. They spent time together in ways that felt restorative rather than charged: shared meals, walks that turned into long conversations, moments of quiet companionship that asked nothing more than presence. Marcus found himself looking forward to these interludes not as escapes, but as extensions of a life finally aligned with his values. Elise, for her part, seemed lighter, her posture less guarded, her laughter less restrained. They never spoke explicitly about the future, and neither felt the need to. What existed between them was built on mutual respect and a refusal to lie, and that was enough for now. One evening, after helping Elise's children with homework at her kitchen table, Marcus caught himself smiling at the mundane intimacy of it all. There was no pretense, no performance, just shared effort and shared space. Later, as he drove home, he realized something had shifted permanently. He was no longer defined by what had been taken from him, but by what he had chosen not to tolerate. The betrayal that once felt catastrophic had, paradoxically, stripped away illusions that kept him small. As spring deepened, Marcus stood in his backyard watching the first signs of new growth emerge where winter had left the ground bare. The metaphor was obvious, almost cliched, but no less true for it. Loss had cleared space. Pain had sharpened his vision. He didn't romanticize what had happened, didn't frame it as destiny or necessary suffering, but he acknowledged the outcome with clear eyes. His life was quieter now, more deliberate, and infinitely more honest. The irony was not lost on him that the future Claire had once proposed, unbounded, undefined, supposedly free, had arrived for him alone, just not in the form she imagined. His world was open now, not to chaos, but to possibility built on integrity. As he locked the door behind him and turned off the lights, Marcus felt no need to look back. Some endings, he understood at last, were not tragedies but corrections.